The story of Coco Chanel, the woman who changed fashion forever. Imagine being abandoned, not once, but twice. Imagine growing up with no money, no family name, no future that anyone could see. Now imagine that from that exact place, from that darkness, that emptiness, you build something so powerful that 100 years later, the whole world still wears your name. This is not a story about fashion. This is a story about survival, about reinvention, about a woman who refused, again and again, at every stage of her life, to be what the world told her she was. And if you stay with this story to the end, you may find that it tells you something not just about her, but about yourself. Chapter 1. A Girl with No Name. In the summer of 1883, in a small town in central France called Saumur, a girl was born. Her name was Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel. But there was nothing in her early years that would suggest happiness, which is what bonheur means in French. Her mother was sick and exhausted. Her father, a traveling market vendor, was restless and irresponsible. The family moved often, always chasing money they never quite caught. When Gabrielle was around 12 years old, her mother died. Her father, perhaps unable or perhaps simply unwilling, packed up his daughters and delivered them to an orphanage run by nuns in the town of Aubezine. He told them he would come back. He never did. And so, in a cold stone building, surrounded by silence and discipline, young Gabrielle learned the first lesson of her life. Do not wait for someone else to save you. The nuns at Aubezine were strict but skilled. They taught the girls to sew, carefully, precisely, with patience. It was a practical skill meant to prepare them for modest, invisible lives. But for Gabrielle, those needles and threads would become something else entirely. She spent 6 years in that orphanage, 6 years of black and white, the nuns' habits, the stone walls, the plain dresses. Perhaps that is why, in later years, simplicity and contrast would become the very foundation of everything she created. She almost never spoke about those years. Later in life, she would invent a different story about herself, a story without orphanages, without abandonment, without poverty. She changed her birth year. She invented a childhood with a kind aunt who raised her in the countryside. She built, in other words, a new identity from nothing. And that act of creating yourself rather than accepting what life gave you was something she would do again and again her entire life. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Sang. When she was 18, Gabrielle left the orphanage and began working as a seamstress in a town called Moulins. But the quiet life of needle and thread was not enough. She had ambition, restless, burning, undefined. In the evenings, she began singing at local cafes and small music halls. She was not a great singer. She was, however, unforgettable. She had a sharp, clear voice and a stage presence that was hard to ignore. She sang 2 songs repeatedly, a popular tune about a lost dog named Coco, and another about a man who had spotted a woman at the Trocadero in Paris. The audiences would shout "Coco" after each performance. Some say that is how she got the nickname. Others say it came from a word her father used as a pet name. Either way, the name stuck, and Gabrielle became Coco. The café concert world of early 20th century France was not a place of great respectability, but it was a place where social rules were slightly looser. where a young woman without a family name could still catch the eye of the right person. And that is exactly what happened. At one of those small, smoky venues, Coco Chanel caught the attention of Etienne Balsan, a wealthy young man who bred racehorses and lived a life of elegant, careless pleasure. Chapter 3. The First Stitch of Freedom. Etienne Balsan was not Coco's great love, but he was her first door. He invited her to live at his grand estate Royal Yeux near Paris. She became his companion, not quite a girlfriend, not quite a guest. The world of wealthy men, their horses and their long country weekends was a world she did not belong to by birth. But she watched it carefully, with sharp eyes. She studied elegance, she studied taste, and she noticed what was wrong. What was wrong, to her eye, was how the women dressed. In the early 1900s, fashionable women wore tight corsets that compressed their bodies into an almost impossible shape. They wore enormous hats decorated with feathers, flowers, and sometimes entire birds. Their clothes were heavy, elaborate, and deeply uncomfortable. They looked, Coco thought, like overdressed furniture. She had a different idea. She began making simple, clean hats, almost boyish in their lack of decoration. Her hats began to attract attention. Women who had grown tired of carrying half a garden on their heads admired the clean lines and lightness of Coco's designs. With the financial help of another admirer, an English businessman named Arthur Capel, she opened her first shop in Paris in 1910. It sold hats, simple, elegant hats. It was a small beginning, but the direction was unmistakable. Bess was going to become more. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Wore Men's Clothes. Coco Chanel did something that women of her time simply did not do. She wore men's clothes. Not as a costume, not as a statement made once for effect, as a genuine way of life. She borrowed sweaters from Etienne Balsan's wardrobe. She wore trousers when she rode horses. She cut her hair short. To the fashionable world around her, this was almost shocking. Women's bodies were supposed to be molded, shaped, and richly decorated. Coco was choosing instead to move freely. And here is the insight that made her a revolutionary. She understood that clothing is not just about appearance, it is about feeling. When you feel restricted, when your body is compressed and decorated into an image someone else invented, you move through the world differently. You hold yourself differently. Coco wanted women to inhabit their bodies with ease. She wanted them to breathe, literally and metaphorically. She began designing clothes from jersey fabric, a soft, stretchy material that had until then been used mainly for men's underwear. It was considered an absurd choice for women's fashion. But jersey moved with the body. It was comfortable and easy, and on the right woman, on Coco Chanel, it looked effortlessly stylish. Women saw it and they understood immediately. This was clothing that let them exist as themselves, not as ornaments. Her collections grew bolder. She borrowed from sailors and sportsmen. She introduced wide-leg trousers, long cardigans, and simple blouses that women could actually work in, walk in, live in. She was not just designing clothes, she was quietly proposing a new kind of woman. One who was active, independent, present in her own life, not standing still in a grand parlor waiting to be admired. Chapter 5. War, Loss, and Love. Running through all of this, like a thread beneath the surface, was Arthur Capel, known to everyone as Boy. He was English, intelligent, politically ambitious, and deeply in love with Coco. She described him in later years as the only man she had ever truly loved. He had supported her financially when her business was just beginning. More than that, he understood her. Her hunger, her intelligence, her need to be something more than what the world expected. The First World War arrived in 1914 and changed everything. Europe went quiet in one way and terribly loud in another. The grand parties stopped. The racehorses stood idle. Men disappeared into trenches, but Coco kept working. In fact, the war worked in her favor, not because she sought to profit from suffering, but because the world suddenly needed exactly what she was already making. Women were entering the workforce in large numbers. They needed to move. Her clothes let them. She opened a shop in the seaside town of Deauville and in another in Biarritz on the southern coast. These were not small boutiques. They were full fashion houses. The wealthy women who had fled the war's disruption discovered Chanel's simple, practical elegance and fell completely in love with it. The business grew with a speed that surprised even those who had believed in her from the beginning. Her revenue from Biarritz alone was enough to repay the loan that Boy Capel had extended when she was just starting out, and that moment mattered enormously to her. Not because of the sum involved, but because of what it represented. She no longer needed to depend on anyone's support to survive. She was no longer relying on the goodwill or the money of a man who might one day walk away. She was a businesswoman in her own right, at a time when that phrase barely applied to women at all. She had arrived, not by accident and not by luck, but by the force of a vision that had never wavered. And through those turbulent, uncertain years, Boy Capel was always somewhere beside her. Until one cold December morning in 1919, he was not. Arthur Capel had married another woman, a noblewoman, because society expected it of him. But he and Coco had remained close. Then, in December of 1919, he was killed in a car accident near the French Riviera. A tire burst at high speed. He died at the roadside before help could arrive. Coco was told by a friend. She collapsed. Later, she wrote that when she lost Boy, she lost everything. The world continued, but something in her went very quiet. She asked to be taken to the place where he died. She stood there alone for a long time. But grief for Coco Chanel did not become paralysis. It became fuel. In the months and years that followed, she worked with an almost frightening intensity. Her clothes became more refined. Her eye became sharper, colder, more precise. It is as if losing the one person who had truly seen her drove her to make the entire world see her instead. Chapter 6. The Little Black Dress. In 1926, Coco Chanel published a design in American Vogue. It showed a simple, straight dress, dark, clean, almost severe in its simplicity. Vogue called it a Ford, the car that had become available to millions of ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy few. The comparison was deliberate. This dress, the magazine suggested, would be worn by every woman everywhere. They were right. We now call it the little black dress. Before Chanel, black clothing was worn for one reason: mourning. A woman in black was a woman in grief. She was dressed in absence. Chanel said no. She said black is elegant, black is clean. Black removes the distraction of color and excessive decoration and places all the attention back on the woman wearing it. It is democratic. The same dress can be worn by a duchess and a working woman, and both can look extraordinary. The little black dress was, in its quiet way, a political act. Fashion had always been a language of status. The more elaborate your clothing, the more important you were assumed to be. Chanel cut through that entirely. She offered a garment that said, "You do not need wealth and excess to be elegant. You need restraint. You need confidence. You need to trust that less is enough." It was the exact opposite of everything fashion had told women before her. Chapter 7. Number 5. In 1921, Coco Chanel met Ernest Beau, a French-Russian chemist who had spent years studying the science and art of perfume. She told him what she wanted, a perfume that smelled like a woman. Not like a flower garden, not like a single ingredient you could name and categorize, but like a woman. Complex, warm, alive. Ernest Beau presented her with a series of numbered samples. She chose the 5th one, and that is how it got its name. Chanel No. 5 was radical for its time. Perfumes before it were simple. They smelled like roses or jasmine or orange blossom. One ingredient, dominant and obvious. No. 5 was the first major perfume to use synthetic aldehydes, chemical compounds that gave it an abstract, multi-layered quality that was difficult to describe. It smelled like something, but you could not quite say what, and that mystery was precisely the point. It was not trying to imitate nature, it was something entirely new. She distributed the perfume at first in an unusual way. She simply wore it herself and gave it to friends and let the scent speak without advertisement. When wealthy women kept asking what she was wearing, the name spread quietly, carried on the air. The bottle, too, was remarkable. Clean, rectangular, almost severe. No flowers on the label, no decorative curves on the glass, just a number, just confidence. Chanel No. 5 became one of the best-selling perfumes in the history of the world. Marilyn Monroe, decades later, was asked what she wore to bed. She answered, "A few drops of Chanel No. 5. Nothing else." That single sentence was worth more than 1,000 advertisements. It confirmed what Chanel had always believed, that true elegance cannot be forced or manufactured. It must be felt. It must be warm as if it already belongs to you. Chapter 8. The Exile. And then came the Second World War, and with it the darkest chapter of Coco Chanel's story. When Germany occupied Paris in 1940, Chanel was nearly 60 years old. She had already closed her fashion house. She moved into the Ritz Hotel in Paris, where high-ranking German officers also lived and dined. And she began a relationship with a German intelligence officer named Hans Günther von Dinklage. The details of what she did during those years remain disputed. We know she tried to use her German connections to take back full ownership of the perfume business she shared with the Wertheimer family, a Jewish family who had co-owned Chanel No. 5 since the 1920s. That attempt failed. We also know she took part in at least one secret mission for the Germans, an attempt to use a private connection to Winston Churchill to open a line of communication between Germany and Britain. Whether she was a willing collaborator, a woman who used the situation for her own benefit, or simply someone making terrible decisions in an impossible time, historians still disagree. What is not in dispute is that her behavior during the war was, at points, deeply wrong. and any honest account of her life must say so clearly. She was not beyond history. She was inside it, like everyone else, and like everyone else, she made choices. Some of those choices were shameful. At the end of the war, she was arrested and questioned by a French committee investigating those who had cooperated with the German occupation. She was released without formal charge, some believe because of her connections to the British establishment, through the Duke of Westminster and old friendships that reached into the highest levels of power. But Paris had not forgiven her. The city that had once called her its queen turned its back, and so Coco Chanel left France and retreated to Lausanne in Switzerland. She would live in exile for nearly a decade. She was alone again. She was outside again, looking at a world that did not want her. It was not so different, perhaps, from a cold stone orphanage in Aubazine. In Lausanne, she lived carefully and quietly. The royalties from her perfume continued to arrive. The business, whatever its complicated history, continued to bring in money, and she was not without money. But financial comfort is not the same as belonging. She had no atelier to return to each morning, no seamstresses waiting for her instructions, no fabric to handle, no designs to argue over, no collections to plan. She was a creator with nothing to create. She read, she corresponded with old friends who had not abandoned her. She watched the fashion world from a distance, noting its changes with an eye that never lost its sharpness or its opinions, and she waited, with a patience she had first learned as a child in discipline and silence, for the right moment to return. It would come. She was certain of it, and if that stone orphanage had not broken her, then neither would this. She had learned long ago that survival is not about the absence of difficulty. It is about what you choose to do with it. Chapter 9. The Comeback. In 1954, Coco Chanel was 70 years old. Most people, the fashion world included, assumed she was finished, a relic, a story from another era. She had been out of fashion in every sense for 15 years, and then she announced a comeback. The reaction from the French press was cruel. Almost every critic said the same thing. Her first new collection, shown in February of 1954, was described as a disappointment, a ghost of the past, a return that no one had asked for. But the Americans saw something different. The editors of American fashion magazines looked at the same collection and recognized what the Parisians had missed. They saw clothes that women could actually live in. They saw the Chanel suit, a collarless jacket with clean, precise lines paired with a simple skirt, and understood immediately that it was the most practical and quietly powerful thing they had seen in years. American buyers placed orders. American women began wearing Chanel. And slowly, reluctantly, Paris began to look again. The Chanel suit became iconic. Jackie Kennedy wore it. Grace Kelly wore it. Heads of state and film stars and working professionals all wore variations of the same quietly confident design. It appeared on the covers of international magazines, in official photographs, in boardrooms and at diplomatic receptions, always conveying the same message of composed, effortless authority. It was not a garment that announced itself from across the room. It was a garment that held its ground wherever it stood. It did not demand attention. It gave authority to the person inside it. The suit said, "I am here. I am serious. I do not need to shout." And that, in any language and in any era, is the language of genuine power. Coco Chanel worked every day after her comeback. Into her 80s, she would spend long hours in her atelier on the Rue Cambon in Paris, adjusting sleeves by millimeters, questioning seams, demanding precision from her seamstresses with intensity that never softened. There is a particular quality of attention that belongs only to people who built everything themselves from nothing, who understand every stitch because they placed every stitch, who know the difference between nearly right and exactly right, because that difference once cost them everything. She had that quality in full measure. The women who worked alongside her described the experience as demanding and sometimes exhausting, but also, quietly and honestly, as one of the finest educations of their professional lives. To be corrected by someone who cared so deeply about the work was itself a form of respect. Some said she was driven by vanity or by the need for money after her years in exile. She offered a simpler answer. She worked because work was the only thing that made her feel completely alive. On the morning of the 10th of January 1971, Coco Chanel died in her room at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. She was 87 years old. She had been working the day before, as she always did. On her bed they found notebooks filled with sketches for her next collection. She did not die resting. She died reaching forward. And perhaps that tells you everything you need to know about who she truly was. Chapter 10. What she left behind. What did she leave behind? A brand, yes, worth billions today. A perfume, still one of the most recognized in the world. A silhouette, the simple, clean, purposeful silhouette that still defines what modern dress can be at its best. But these are facts, and facts are not the same as meaning. The real legacy of Coco Chanel is an idea. The idea that how you present yourself to the world is a choice, not a sentence handed to you by your birth, your social class, your history, or your past. A choice. She grew up in an orphanage, in black and white, in poverty and institutional silence, and she chose to create something that would outlive her by centuries. That is not a fashion story. That is a deeply human story. She gave women a kind of permission they had not been offered before. Permission to be comfortable, permission to wear what made them feel like themselves rather than like a performance. Permission to be simple, restrained, and powerful, all at once and without apology. Before Chanel, the fashionable woman was defined largely by what others, usually men, found beautiful. After Chanel, she was defined, at least in part, by what she found beautiful in herself. That shift was quiet, and it was enormous. She was also deeply contradictory, and we should not pretend otherwise. She could be generous and deeply cruel, sometimes to the same person within the same conversation. Her wartime behavior casts a shadow over her legacy that does not fade with time or admiration. She was anti-Semitic at points in her life. She lied about her past so completely and so consistently that serious biographers still argue about basic facts of her biography. She was not a saint. She was not a simple heroine. She was a complicated, brilliant, damaged, and determined human being. And perhaps that is precisely why her story still matters. Closing reflection. Here is what I want to leave you with. Coco Chanel was abandoned before she had a name anyone remembered. She was poor. She was female in a world that gave women almost no power. She was illegitimate, orphaned, discarded. Every conventional story of her time said, "This is where you end. This is the ceiling above you. This is what you are." And she looked at all of that, and she decided, slowly, imperfectly, defiantly, that it was not a conclusion. It was just a beginning. We all carry histories we did not choose, circumstances we were born into, losses we did not ask for, labels that others placed on us before we were old enough to question them. It is easy, looking at Chanel from the distance of a century, to see only the triumph and to miss the cost, the years of relentless work, the loneliness that sat at the center of even her most celebrated moments, the grief that never fully left her after Boy Capel died on a roadside in the south of France. But she continued anyway. She made things. She kept going. The question that Coco Chanel's life raises is not whether you can fully escape those things. You cannot. The past does not disappear just because you decide to move forward. But the question she lived her entire life answering was this: what do you make from what you were given? What do you build in the space between what happened to you and who you decide to become? She once said, and this is one of the few statements her biographers agree she actually made, "I don't do fashion, I am fashion." It sounds like arrogance, the kind of thing you might expect from someone with an enormous ego and very little self-awareness. But I think it was something else. I think it was the statement of a woman who had finally, after decades of survival and constant reinvention, stopped waiting for the world to define her. She had defined herself. And then she had built an entire life, an entire world around that decision. That is not vanity, that is will. And it is perhaps the rarest and most difficult thing there is, to look at the raw material of your own life, however broken or ordinary, and decide to make something of it that the world cannot ignore. She knew what it meant to be on the outside, to be invisible, to be dismissed. She knew what it felt like to be told, by silence and circumstance, that you did not belong. And she spent her whole life building something from that feeling, not in spite of the exclusion, but partly because of it. The outsider's eye sees what the insider takes for granted, and what Coco Chanel saw, looking at the world from the cold edges of it, was that almost everything could be done differently and better. You are listening to this story in English, and perhaps English is not the language you grew up speaking. You are doing, right now, something that takes real courage. You are learning, expanding, reaching beyond the boundary of what is already comfortable and familiar. Coco Chanel would understand that feeling. She knew what it was to reach beyond the world you were given, into the world you could only imagine. And she knew, because she lived it, that the reaching itself is not a detour on the way to something better. The reaching is the thing. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, if it made you pause even for a moment and think about who you are, who you might become, or what you might be capable of building from the particular materials your life has given you, then it has done everything it was meant to do. We will be back with another great story. Until then, keep listening, keep learning, and keep reaching.